Hi, everyone. This is the AP exam review video for Unit 5 and Unit 6. Unit 5 and 6 are in the modern era, which is 1750 to 1900. I've got the review paper up on the screen, and a copy of the review paper should be like right underneath this video on Schoology. So Unit 5 is focused around political revolutions as well as the Industrial Revolution, whereas Unit 6 is officially called Consequences of Industrialization, but really like the topic of the unit is imperialism. Like that's the consequence of industrialization. European states can engage in imperialism. So this is actually quite a big time period, Unit 5 and Unit 6, the modern era. There's a lot of information here. Unit 5 is usually one of the tests that students don't do as great on. So I would make sure to pay a good amount of attention to Unit 5 and Unit 6 because it is a lot of content. Let's see, if I think about the past couple of years, I want to say there's been like 1 or 2 DBQs from this time period in the last 5 years. So possible that it could be the DBQ prompt, but most likely there will be one LEQ from this time period, from 1750 to 1900. So starting off, Unit 5, Revolutions, we're beginning with the Enlightenment and political revolutions. The Enlightenment is a time period, it happens in Europe, where humans are starting to use reason and empiricism and logic and observation to try to understand the world around them and make conclusions about the world around them. So contextualization for this could be scientific revolution from our previous time period. With the Enlightenment, thinkers are trying to use reason and observation to make conclusions about like the political and social world versus the natural scientific world with the scientific revolution. So some thinkers that go with the Enlightenment, John Locke, who was alive in the 1600s, late 1600s in England, who provides a lot of the theoretical justification for England's transition to a constitutional monarchy during its Glorious Revolution. Baron Charles de Montesquieu of France, also alive in the 1600s. He's the big proponent of 3 separate branches of government and checks and balances to make sure that the 3 separate branches each have their own tasks and limits on what each branch can do to prevent an abuse of power. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talked about the social contract. So as an intellectual ideology, the Enlightenment, again, is using science and rational thinking to question the absolute power of the monarch and perhaps to question the power of the Catholic Church, because a place like France, where Montesquieu lives, has a government official named Cardinal Richelieu of the Catholic Church who gets to basically like establish the French absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. So he is, Montesquieu would be opposed to the abuse of power of the Catholic Church in orchestrating French absolutism. The Enlightenment is going to lead to rebellions against governments in like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Haitian Revolution, and it also inadvertently leads to growing nationalism that's going to spread across Europe after the French Rev. Next bullet is impact of the Enlightenment on societies, including women. Long term, the Enlightenment will contribute to reform movements. For example, a movement to expand suffrage to poor people, to people of color, to women. That's long term. Some of these goals, like women's suffrage, that won't happen until the next time period, 1900. So that's why I'm saying long-term impact here. But in the time period, women do not get the right to vote. Long term, the Enlightenment will help lead to abolitionist movements to get rid of slavery. But again, that's long term. It doesn't happen immediately during the Enlightenment. It's going to happen after that in the mid 1800s. Mary Wollstonecraft is an English women's rights activist. She wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And in that book, she urges women to have equal education to men, or well, we could say she's advocating for girls to have equal education to the men so that girls can help like the boys make decisions, help the men make decisions when they become adults. She is not necessarily advocating for women to have the right to vote. So she's not like what we would today consider a feminist thinker who wants full equality for women in the political, economic, and societal sector, or like I guess we could really even say like feminism is saying that everyone, regardless of gender, should be equal. So Mary Wollstonecraft is not quite there. She's arguing for equal education, but she would be inspired by some enlightened ideas. Olympe de Gouges is the French women's rights activist. She wrote Declaration of Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, which is taking the French National Assembly's Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen document and rewriting it to make sure that the same rights apply to women. The document she writes is her advocating for women to have equality, demanding equal rights for women, but it's not something that's officially adopted by the government. It would be like if I rewrote the American Declaration of Independence, that document that I wrote would essentially be meaningless. It's not an official government document, but it's her like advocating for those equal rights. Seneca Falls Conference happens in 1848. This is in a meeting in New York in the United States. It involves women's rights activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. It's the first conference on women's rights. You actually have a lot of abolitionist activists there too, like Frederick Douglass, people advocating to get rid of slavery in the United States. And they write a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is similar to Olympe de Gouges' document. It asserts that women should have equality in the political world, in education, in jobs, in religion. So this is kind of like taking it a step farther than Mary Wollstonecraft did. But of course, women are not getting any of these rights in this time period. It won't be until the 1900s that women start to get suffrage and other rights. For example, women couldn't have their own bank accounts without the permission of like their husband or their dad until like the 1970s. Like women couldn't get a credit card until the 1970s. So women again, even though women's rights are built on Enlightenment ideas, they're not getting those rights until the 1900s, until later on. Okay, next bullet is nationalism and revolutions. So nationalism is a sense of commonality with other people who share the same language as you, or religion, or ethnic identity, same social customs, living on the same land. This nationalism can foster unity between people who have these similarities. And nationalism is going to spread across Europe after the French Revolution. Down at the bottom, if I skip down for a moment, if I kind of bypass the political revolutions, examples of nationalism are going to include Maori nationalism in New Zealand, fighting against the British. Balkan nationalism, where the Greek people in the Balkans are pushing for independence against the Ottomans, or the Serbians pushing for independence against the Ottomans. It's that nationalism in the Balkans that's leading to those independence movements in like the 1830s-ish. The other two big examples, sorry, mosquito, Germany and Italy both experienced unification movements in the late 1800s, like 1860s, 1870s. These unification movements are built around this idea that the German people should have one state and that the Italian people should have one state, based on like the shared commonalities, shared language, shared background, whatever. And that, again, that leads to German unification under Otto von Bismarck. And Otto von Bismarck is going to rapidly industrialize Germany after unification. And in Italy, leaders like Giuseppe Garibaldi are kind of big proponents of Italian unification. I don't expect names like Garibaldi, Mazzini, Victor Emmanuel, King Victor Emmanuel. I don't expect names like that to appear on the AP exam. Just know that the Italian unification is an example of nationalism. We could also include Theodor Herzl leading the Zionist movement, pushing for the Jews to have their own state because of the context of the time. Jews experienced so much discrimination and persecution, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia at the time. Okay, popping back up here now, causes and effects of political revolutions. Generally, political revolutions are caused by discontent or unhappiness with the monarch or imperial rule. It's going to be supported by liberal ideas and proponents of the Enlightenment. And a lot of these political revolutions will base their revolutionary documents around enlightened principles from John Locke or Montesquieu or Rousseau. For example, the American Revolution causes no representation in government. The colonists felt they lacked popular sovereignty and republicanism. And republicanism, remember, is a subset of popular sovereignty. It refers to the idea that people vote for their leaders. American Revolution is also caused by a desire to get rid of colonial rule, unfair taxation. Their revolutionary document is Declaration of Independence. That document lists the unalienable rights from John Locke. It mentions the social contract, where the government exists to protect the people's rights. And if the government doesn't protect the people's rights, the people have a right to change their government. So that comes from Locke. It reflects the English principles that help support the English Glorious Revolution, which gave them a constitutional monarchy in the 1600s. The Declaration also lists colonial grievances. It lists the complaints against the king and parliament, and many of those grievances will later be fixed by the American Declaration of Independence. For example, the colonists didn't like that they had to quarter soldiers, didn't like that they couldn't have weapons to defend themselves against the British soldiers, so Second Amendment is added to the Constitution to protect the people's right to bear arms, and Third Amendment is added to the Constitution to make sure that soldiers won't be quartered anymore. And remember, like, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. So when I say it gets added to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution. So there you go. Okay, effects of American Revolution. It is the first successful establishment of a new republic that is going to inspire future revolutions. It proves that enlightened ideas can be put into practice and they can work. So, for example, Toussaint Louverture in Haiti will be inspired by this. Who else? Simon Bolivar in South America will be inspired by this. And even like in the 1900s, when decolonization movements are happening, people like Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam will be inspired by this document to try to declare independence from France and fight a war for independence. Next bullet is French Rev, causes no popular sovereignty, challenging the absolute power of the monarch, social inequality, because France had a rigid social hierarchy, the poor people, the third estate, they were taxed heavily. They had no representation in government at all. That their parliament, which was called the Estates General, hadn't been called in like 100 years. And the upper classes, the nobles and the clergy, the priests, they did not pay any taxes. So social inequality plays a big role in this revolution, but not the American Revolution. Also, money problems. France has a lot of long-term debt from Versailles and from helping the colonists in the American Revolution. During the French Revolution, the Third Estate is going to declare themselves to be a national assembly. They're going to write Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is a document that ensures rights for all men in France. That would be more similar to the Bill of Rights in the US than the Declaration of Independence. At first, the National Assembly is going to share power with the monarch. So that means they'll have a constitutional monarchy. But at some point, you know, King Louis is going to be beheaded. So France will temporarily get rid of a monarch. It'll temporarily have popular sovereignty and temporarily have a republic. But ultimately, after the Reign of Terror, by the year 1800-ish, France is going to go back to having a dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte, who has some liberal views, has some conservative views, but France is not going to end up with like the republic form of government, the popular sovereignty, the equal rights that the people of the revolution wanted. So maybe not as successful in achieving goals of the Enlightenment as the American Revolution. Um, Side note, for the American Revolution, we could say limits to enlightened ideas being put into practice. Women can't vote, poor men can't vote, people of color can't vote upon independence. So there are some limits to how enlightened the American Revolution actually is. Haitian Revolution, that is the only successful slave revolt in history. In the Haitian Revolution, the people wanted to get rid of French colonialism, but also get rid of slavery. For the faction of enslaved people led by Toussaint Louverture, they're trying to get rid of slavery, and then eventually get rid of French absolutism, French monarchy. Ultimately, Haiti is able to get rid of French colonial rule in, I think, 1804. They get rid of slavery too, so successful there. Downside, countries don't want to trade with Haiti and buy their sugar because countries don't want to be seen as approving of this successful slave revolt. Because countries like Britain and the United States did have slavery at this point. So there we go, Haitian Revolution. Next one is Latin American revolutions. The Latin American revolutions were revolts against Spanish colonialism. We have Simon Bolivar in South America pushing for independence. He wrote a document called the Jamaica Letter, in which he expresses the colonial grievances similar to the American Declaration of Independence. One of his big grievances is Spain, or the colonists didn't have economic opportunities. They didn't like living under mercantilism, just like the American colonists. But that letter also reflects the idea that it's the Creoles that want independence. The Creoles want political equality for themselves, not necessarily for the mestizos, for the indigenous people, for the enslaved people. This is a similarity with the independence war in Mexico, where the Mexican War for Independence sort of began as a peasant revolt with Father Miguel Hidalgo, but ultimately, independence is achieved by the conservative Creole military officials like Augustin de Iturbide. And the people in the Mexican War for Independence don't actually end up getting equal rights for the lower classes, for the peasants. So there's some limits of how successful the Mexican War for Independence is, and for the South American one as well. Just make sure to remember that for the South American Revolution, desire to get rid of mercantilist economic policies is a big thing, a similarity with the American Revolution. And the other thing you want to remember again is that Creoles are the ones that get independence, not necessarily all the lower classes. Okay, so that's political revolutions and the Enlightenment. I'm going to scroll down now to beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because the second part of Unit 5 is Industrial Revolution, which is generally pretty easy. It's not a super challenging topic. It's just making sure to know what College Board wants you to know about industrialization. So sort of setting the scene for the Industrial Revolution, we had cottage industries and proto-industrialization in the early modern era. That's going to lead to entrepreneurs making money from selling products in cities, and entrepreneurs can use that capital to then buy a patent for a machine and build a factory around the machine and get workers to start working in a factory, mass producing products instead of having people work at their home. So we kind of have a progression. Cottage industry leads to the factory system, leads to specialized labor, where people can, again, like innovate technology, make a machine, have a patent for it, sell their machine, and a factory owner will buy it. You need to know factors that lead to industrialization. There's certain environmental factors that are needed for a place to industrialize. For example, proximity to waterways like rivers and canals that will be used for transportation. Having coal, iron, lumber, or timber resources on your land, because at the time you need coal to run the machines, like with the steam engine. You need iron and lumber to build the factory. Without those things, you really can't industrialize. The government has to legally protect private property, protect patents, there has to be enough capital or money available for people to be able to borrow money to buy a machine and build a factory. And usually there has to be a colony that the mother country has where resources can be obtained from the colony to use in the factory. So England is going to be the first place to industrialize because they have all these factors. It's not going to be India or China that industrializes first. It's going to be England, which is a big change in world history because prior to this time period, the modern era, it was India, China, and the Middle East that made most of the world stuff. Now a big change is that England, Britain is going to be making most of the world stuff. That's actually the thing that makes the modern era unique. For unit 3 and 4, I said that the thing that makes that time period special is truly global interactions for the first time, global trade. For the modern era, the special thing is industrialization. Okay. Oh, sorry, one other thing. A society also has to have increased agricultural production in order for people to be able to specialize in labor and have enough food and people to be workers. Next bullet is industrialization spreads, begins in England, but spreads to the rest of Europe, including Germany, which is led by Otto von Bismarck, having recently unified. Otto von Bismarck is going to rapidly industrialize Germany in order to demonstrate their wealth and their superiority. So it'll spread from England to Europe, especially Germany. It'll spread to the United States in the late 1800s. It'll spread to Russia and Japan. And the special things about Russia and Japan is that they state sponsor industry. You need to be able to give examples of state sponsored industry and explain how it's different than like capitalist driven industry that takes place in the US, Europe, and Britain. For Russia, it's Romanov czars like Alexander II in the 1860s that state sponsor industry. For example, government sponsors building Trans-Siberian Railway. In Japan, it's Emperor Meiji and the Meiji Restoration. They state sponsor industry by building off of German industrialization. Remember, they sent students to the US and to Germany to learn about industrialization and to learn about their government implemented in Japan. Modes and locations, sometimes they ask about like first industrial revolution versus second industrial revolution, which isn't like explicitly stated in the binder, but we would say like the first or the beginning of the industrial revolution begins in mid 1700s, begins in England, and it's focused around the textile industry, being able to mass produce cloth and then clothes to clothe the Earth's growing population, kind of in the context of Columbian Exchange having increased the global population. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution is also going to see the emergence of steam power using a steam engine, which is powered by coal to power things. Like early on, be like steamboats. Whereas the second Industrial Revolution is maybe like late 1800s, it spread to America, it spread to Japan. At that point, there's going to be a revolution in transportation. So using the steam engine to build railroads and locomotives and having long distance travel being a lot easier and a lot more efficient. You can ship people and products much faster and cheaper than before. Second Industrial Revolution also oversees the mass production of steel using the Bessemer process. So now cities can really be built with big skyscrapers supported by steel. Elevators will be built in buildings supported by steel. Big bridges. There will also be innovations in the medical sphere, like vaccines. Edward Jenner, 1797, is the smallpox vaccine. Antiseptics invented by Joseph Lister to clean surgical instruments to make sure bacteria can't grow on them. Telephone, telegraph. Now I'm drawing a blank. But like all the different innovations in the Crystal Palace, all the new innovations to increase the standard of living and make life easier. Impact on Middle East and Asia. So big thing here. Middle East and Asia will still manufacture goods, but they're not manufacturing goods in factories. So the goods they make aren't going to be made quickly. They're not going to be made cheaply. So their overall share of the global manufacturing is going to decline. Now it's going to be British mass-produced products will replace the Asian ones on the global marketplace. And now most of the world's products will be made out of European factories or American factories. So Indian shipbuilding, for example, Southeast Asian shipbuilding, that industry declines because Europe can now mass produce ships faster. India used to have processes for making iron into steel. So did China. Those processes aren't going to be used. Now, Britain is going to mass produce steel in factories. That steel is going to replace any iron that the Indians were making. Textile production. India and Egypt used to make a lot of the world's textiles. Now it's Britain. Their mass-produced cloth and clothes are going to replace Indian and Egyptian cloth and clothes. Okay. Technology in the industrial age. Technology shapes economic production. So, like machines, technology makes machines. That's going to shape economic production because now things can be mass produced in factories. So, examples steam engine, which requires coal. Steam engine is going to support a transportation revolution, steamships, locomotives, etc. Then later, around the year 1900, it's going to be oil. Oil is going to replace the coal. So we'll see a fossil fuel revolution with petroleum in the 1900s. For second industrial revolution, Bessemer process to make steel, chemicals like that carbolic acid, which cleans surgical instruments invented by Joseph Lister, railroads, steamships, telegraph. All of these things are going to help facilitate imperialism, which is in Unit 6, because now Europeans can push into interior regions of colonies. They can trade more. People can now migrate. So we can have more migration from like Europe to the United States or more migration between colonies. For example, Indians will be recruited to be indentured laborers in South Africa. So all of this like industrial technology will help facilitate that migration and trade. Next bullet is government role in industry. This is the state-sponsored industry. We need to know that some places have governments overseeing the industrialization rather than businesses doing it. So Muhammad Ali, state sponsors industry in Egypt with the cotton industry and the Navy in early 1800s. Japan has the Meiji Restoration in 1867, 1868. They state sponsor industry using Germany and the US as a model. That helps Japan industrialize really quickly. The whole thing with state-sponsored industry means that the government can mobilize its resources. So the industrialization can happen a lot faster than it did in Britain and the US. Russia state sponsors industry under Tsar Alexander II in the late 1800s. They build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which gets Russia access to resources in the eastern part of their territory. Economic develops and innovations. We now have a shift away from mercantilism from early modern era to laissez-faire capitalism. So free trade, government keeping its hands off of the economy, letting businesses kind of do what they want. This is based on Adam Smith's economic principles from his book, The Wealth of the Nations in 1776. Again, he argues that large corporations should be able to make whatever economic decisions that they want. That allows large corporations to dominate societies. Like in the US, Carnegie's US Steel Company monopolizes steel. John Rockefeller monopolizes oil with his company Standard Oil. And these big robber barons can use their money to manipulate Congress, to make sure the workers aren't protected, all in an effort to like make profits. These are our first like millionaires. Some of these big corporations are HSBC, which is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which is a British company. Unilever, which is a British-Dutch company. They operate in British West Africa and the Belgian Congo. They are using capitalism to increase their profits and manipulate workers and exploit colonies of their resources. The next bullet says proliferation of transnational businesses. Again, there's more transnational businesses that are operated out of like the imperial power, but they get their resources from the colonies and use labor, use or exploit their workers' labor to mass produce their product. This is all thanks to global trade. They can increase their large scale transnational businesses. They might rely on um, new banking, there's a term for it, new banking, something, institutions, um, and financial practices like having LLCs, which is a limited liability corporation that can't be sued. The owners aren't going to lose all their money if their company is sued. And stock markets, which give people the ability to buy ownership in a company and give people the ability to make profits off that company. So everything is profit driven, trying to make as much money as possible, perhaps through like exploiting their workers or exploiting the colony that they're getting the resources from. Next is reactions to the industrial economy, socialism, communism, workers' rights movement, reform movements. These are all reactions to the industrial economy. Labor unions emerge to push for improved working conditions, like limiting hours from 12 hours a day to 8 hours a day, or pushing for higher wages. At first, it's very hard for labor unions to push for better rights and better pay because of the laissez-faire policies that make it so that labor unions aren't allowed. But eventually, over time, labor unions become legal and workers can push for better rights. Socialism and communist movements emerge to try to deal with the class inequality that comes from capitalism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels write the Communist Manifesto, I think in 1848, as a reaction against capitalism and the inequality it produces. They want to eliminate these class divisions and inequality. With communism, it would be through a violent revolution where the workers violently seize control of the means of production to ensure that the factory will be run equally, profits and there won't be this big income gap between the business owners and the people. In this time period, in the modern era, the communist revolutions aren't happening yet. That'll be in our next time period. That's when these communist ideas are put into practice, but the ideas are popping up in the modern era as a reaction against industrialization. The reform movements in Asia are like Tanzimat reforms, Emancipation Manifesto in Russia, the attempts at having reform movements in China with 100-day reforms and self-strengthening. Generally, the reform movements are not enough to fix the consequences of industrialization, of foreigners industrializing. But I would make sure to like review Tanzimat reforms, which are based on the Enlightenment, but don't do enough to like fix the Ottoman Empire, or 100-day reforms or self-strengthening. I would like make sure to look up some of that stuff because usually people don't remember that even when we're going over this in Unit 5. Again, I wrote Ottomans, Qing try to reform, but usually fail. Tanzimat reforms, self-strengthening, 100-day reforms. Impact on society, social hierarchy, there's new social classes, primarily a new middle class. The middle class is going to be managers of factories, not the owners, but the managers who are above the workers, plus new specialized jobs like doctors. Remember, the medical movement is kind of emerging in this time period. Plus, there's a new group of workers, the working class, that are factory workers. So that's like the new social classes now. Also, a new social class, it used to be that the elites were traditional elites, like the nobles in Britain, like the traditional Lord so-and-so, Duke of whatever. Their family had had power and money for like centuries. Now there's a new social class of elites that are the new money elites who have made their money from factory work. They've owned factories. They've made a bunch of money. They don't have these like landed titles. They're just now really rich because they've made all this money from owning their factory. So that's another like new social class. Impacts on women. Middle and upper class women tend to stay at home. They don't work, but working class women work, especially a lot of like immigrant women in the United States, in the big cities, they have to work. Um, there's rapid industrialization in London, in the United States, in Germany. That leads to a lot of pollution from burning the coal in the factories. Um, Plus a lot of crime, like the Jack the Ripper murders in the Whitechapel section of the East End in London. A lot of spread of disease, public health crises, like the spread of cholera from having contaminated water. Housing shortages. Remember, the lower class live in the dirty, crowded tenements. Insufficient infrastructure. Initially, because of industrialization, there's going to be a lot of problems in cities, but over time, industrialization can fix the problems like building sewage systems and sanitation systems. It just takes a while. So initially, a lot of problems associated with urbanization, but long term, some of those problems can be addressed. Okay, that was Unit 5. Unit 5 really is a lot. It's a lot of stuff. So is Unit 6. I'm kind of scared that I'm not even going to finish this video before the bell rings and it's time for lunch. So let me go as fast as I can, hitting Unit 6. So Unit 6 is Consequences of Industrialization. That's the official title. It's imperialism, essentially. Imperialism is the consequence of industrialization. If you have an essay about imperialism, your contextualization should be Industrial Revolution. Britain, France, Germany, US, they industrialize. They need raw materials and resources for their factories, so they go and seek colonies in order to obtain those resources to use in their factories to mass produce products. I said the US in my example, but one could argue the US really only becomes an imperial power after the Spanish-American War. So maybe the US isn't the best example there, but definitely Britain, France, Germany, they're setting up colonies to obtain natural resources to use in their factory to mass produce a product. First topic in the binder for imperialism is rationales. What's the reasons for imperialism, or the justification that Europeans use to engage in imperialism? First one is religious and cultural. They believe in, white man's burden, the civilizing mission, that the white Europeans are somehow biologically superior to cultures around the world, and they have this mission to convert people to Christianity and elevate people's status by teaching them about British culture, French culture, German culture, and like civilizing the people around the world. The US uses this civilizing mission argument, this white man's burden argument, to justify colonizing the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Even though it was clear the Filipinos wanted independence, the US believed that the Philippines wasn't, I don't know, elevated enough to be able to rule themselves. So the US colonizes them. These, like, the social Darwinism is tied to this as well. The real reason would be economic rationales. European countries want colonies to obtain natural resources to use in their factory. And I think there's some point in here where we list all of the different resources that each place wanted. So we'll get to that in a moment so you can have some examples of what economic resources Europeans wanted. Okay, next, the binder wants you to be able to compare the processes that Europeans use to colonize land. So some places already have colonies, like the Dutch already has the Spice Islands. So some places strengthen control over their existing colony in the modern era, whereas other states might convert, or okay, whereas some might assume direct control over a colony that was previously controlled by a non-state entity. So that means that if a place like India was previously controlled by an East India Company, that colony is going to go from being under a non-state entity, the company, to now being controlled by the state, by the British government. So again, for like colonies that were already controlled by a mother country, like the Dutch already control Indonesia through the VOC, Britain already controls parts of India through the East India Company. Now those places are going to get moved under state control. They'll go from non-state to state colonial control. Example, King Leopold, his Congo Free Colony becomes a Belgian colony after his like abuse is discovered. India in 1857 gets converted from company rule to a direct colony because of the Sepoy Rebellion. The Dutch East India Company is going to transfer control of Indonesia to the Dutch government. Whereas other places might be colonized through warfare or diplomacy to expand an empire. For example, the French are going to take over West Africa. The British will take over parts of West Africa as well, but the French have the majority of West Africa. Um, the Europeans might use the Opium War, like in China, to sort of colonize the land, so to speak, and establish spheres of influence to take away China's autonomy. Other places might have colonies established to be a settler colony to get Europeans to move there, given the limited amount of land in Europe. The British in New Zealand, in South Africa, in Australia, those are all settler colonies. To some degree, the French colony Morocco has some settlers move there, sort of a settler colony. But we want to remember that there's a lot of native Algerians living there who follow Islam. Um, Remember that Spain and Portugal loses their imperial influence in this time period. They've lost their hegemony. They lose their colonies. For example, Spain loses its colonies after the Spanish-American War in 1898. The United States will then obtain their colonies, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba to some degree, and the Philippines. The US and Japan are going to get colonies in Asia and the Pacific. The US will also colonize Hawaii, and the United States will, there's like some law in like 1850-ish that gives Americans the ability to sail into the Pacific and take over any island that has guano on it where other people aren't living. So the US ends up getting lots of islands throughout the Pacific. Japan gets colonies in the Pacific as well. Sometimes a place expands their borders not overseas, like not in a maritime empire, but sometimes it's more land-based, like before 1898, the US expands its borders by conquering neighboring states, conquering neighboring territory, kind of like Manifest Destiny. It's like continental, like they're getting land at their borders. Russia does that too. Russia doesn't really have a lot of overseas colonies. Russia expands land at their border. So US and Russia have that thing in common. Whereas like Britain and France take over colonies overseas with a maritime empire. Okay, next bullet is indigenous responses to state expansion. We want to know internal and external factors for like challenges to state expansion. Sometimes growing nationalism in a colony is going to lead to the people to push to get rid of the colonial rule. It's going to be unsuccessful though. The binder names 3 methods of resistance to imperial rule. You want to know the 3 methods. First is direct resistance, where the people fight directly against the imperial power, perhaps in a war. Example, 1857 Sepoy Rebellion in India, which fails. Lost my train of thought. Boxer Rebellion in China is the Chinese people fighting against foreign rule. That fails. Tupac Amaru II in South America fights against Spanish colonial rule. That fails. Yaosantawa War in West Africa fails. Samari Touré War in West Africa fails. So sometimes people fight a war. Also the Philippines. They fight a war against first Spanish colonization and later American colonization. Both fail. Sometimes people resist empire by creating new states separate from the colony or like the empire. Example, Greece, Serbia fight Ottoman imperialism. They're successful creating new states in the Balkans. The Cherokee create a new nation separate from the United States. They're mostly successful, sort of semi-successful, we'll say. Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, they separate from a British colony and set up their own caliphate in Nigeria for the Muslim population. I don't think they're successful long term though, because I think the British eventually take them over. And same thing with the Zulu people, Shaka Zulu in the southern part of Africa. They separate and create a new state away from the British colony, but I think eventually the British take them over. The other one, the third method is, oh no, it says rebellions. add that. And it should say religious. So religious resistance to imperialism, using a religion to determine how you're going to resist. So ghost dance among the Sioux people, unsuccessful resistance against Americans. Xhosa cattle killing in southern Africa, unsuccessful religious movement pushing against the British. Um, there's one more, Maji Maji Rebellion in the German East African colony, unsuccessful using religion to resist German imperialism. That could be an LEQ, compare and contrast the methods that people use to resist imperialism, direct resistance, new states, rebellions. New states seem to be the most successful. That would be a good LEQ to set up there. And you just need to know like 2 examples for each argument and be able to talk about them. Okay, global economic development. So this sort of ties into the contextualization. Factories in Europe, the United States, and Japan need raw materials to run their factories. Their population needs more food supplies. Therefore, they might colonize an area in order to get a food resource or a natural resource. And those colonies end up developing an export economy that specialize in just like growing bananas, growing coffee, harvesting rubber, mining coal, and exporting that like to the mother country. So I'm going to go through all the different environmental resources and where that resource comes from. So, cotton comes out of Egypt. Cotton also comes out of India. The British might want to colonize India to get their cotton resources. Palm oil comes from West Africa. The French might want to colonize West Africa to get that palm oil resource and exploit the labor of the West Africans to obtain that natural resource and use it to make soap in a Unilever factory. Guano. Guano is the bat poop. It's an important fertilizer given context industrialization. There's now sewer systems. So now we need a new fertilizer source to fertilize crops. A lot of guano in Peru, Chile, and the Pacific Islands. So Europeans and Americans might want to colonize Pacific Islands to get the guano resources. What else? Rubber coming out of the Amazon and the Congo. King Leopold colonizes the Congo, makes it his own personal colony to get their rubber and ivory resources to sell to make money. Diamonds, South Africa. Think Cecil Rhodes. Meat, like ranching, a lot in South America, like Uruguay and Argentina. And companies, want to support imperialism because they can make money extracting these resources from the colony. And in theory, like the colonists can then purchase European finished goods, but really that's not happening so much. It's more using the colony to extract its resources. The United States tends to do a lot of this economic imperialism, not through setting up a direct colony, but by using companies to exploit labor in like a semi-colonized area. So a lot of economic imperialism in Asia and Latin America, particularly in China. The spheres of influence in China set up by Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. They are there for the imperial power to take resources from China and to control their trade, but without setting up like a formal colonial government. They're still the Qing dynasty. They're just super weak and can't do anything about these Europeans setting up the spheres of influence. The US has its fruit company, United Fruit, go into places like Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala. The fruit company is going to buy up a bunch of land. The fruit company is going to force laborers to work, not pay them well, not give them good housing, and they can use their money from the fruit company to bribe the local leader to make sure there are policies in place to protect the fruit company. So like a place like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, they're not direct American colonies, but we use the United Fruit Company to control what happens in that place. So we would, again, call that like economic imperialism. Obviously, again, Europe and US have an advantage. They're the imperial powers. More examples of commodities that fuel economic imperialism: palm oil in Africa, cotton grown in South Asia and Egypt to be used to export to Britain. Um, the British selling opium in China, that's some economic imperialism. The British grow opium in the Middle East and India and export that to China to sell for profit. Um, and the United Fruit Company. Always remember United Fruit Company, the bananas in Latin America. We don't colonize those places outright. We use the fruit company to extract the place of resources and dominate those states. And the last two things on here are migration, causes of migration and effects of migration. So causes, first of all, a lot of people move from rural areas to cities in order to work in factories. Transportation systems like railroads can support that migration. Um, uh, a lot of Europeans, a lot of Eastern Europeans will move to the United States to get jobs in these factories. Like a lot of Irish move to America, a lot of Italians move to America to find jobs working in factories. Some British might move to South Asia in order to set up factories there, like Lipton Tea. Um, but there's also a lot of Chinese migration. A lot of Chinese laborers move to Australia or move to the United States to get jobs mining gold and then later like building railroads. The Chinese are trying to escape problems back at home with the weak Qing dynasty and with Taiping rebellion that's brought a lot of violence to China. Those laborers are usually welcomed with nativist policies like White Australia policy in Australia and Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States. They face a lot of nativism, discrimination, and racism. Fueled by social Darwinism and the idea that the Chinese are somehow inferior to the white Americans and white Australians. There's also a lot of migration of indentured laborers. A lot of, for example, Indian indentured laborers are recruited to go to South Africa, a fellow British colony, and work there. A lot of Japanese agricultural workers or Chinese agricultural workers are recruited to go to Hawaii to work on fruit plantations there. So there's a lot of migration of indentured laborers from Asia. Once those, how do you say this? Once imperialism comes to some of these like new Asian places that were isolated for a long time, like Australia, Hawaii, the native people there will get sick from diseases and die, just like the Aztecs and Incas did when the Europeans got there in the previous time period. So there will be a lot of like disease-related deaths of the native people in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, for example. And a lot of indentured labor and migration after that to replace the natives who died. What else? Oh, a lot of British settler migration to their settler colonies, including convicts who moved to Australia to do convict labor. I said Indians move to other British colonies like South Africa for indentured labor. Sometimes people do return, like a lot of European immigrants returned back home to Europe. About a third of the European immigrants moving to the Americas go back home. Effects of migration, sometimes ethnic enclaves or, neighborhoods pop up in cities, like a neighborhood for the Italians who moved to New York. A lot of women will take on new roles because if European women are moving to America, they have to work in a factory to make money to survive in the city. So women are taking on new roles in factories. A lot of prejudice, Chinese Exclusion Act, White Australia policy. Those are the big things I can think of off the top of my head. Um, okay, I think that's it for Unit 5 and Unit 6. Again, it's a lot. This one and Unit 3, 4 kind of require a lot of studying because there's just so much information here. Unit 5 and 6 are definitely going to be a substantial part of the multiple choice section, maybe 5 stimuli from Unit 5 and 6. Possibly an SAQ from this time period, potentially the DBQ topic, because again, there was an imperialism DBQ a couple years ago. Maybe an industrialization one. But I really think this year the DBQ will come from Unit 3 and 4, just personally. Keep in mind, though, there's multiple versions of the AP exam. So, like, you could be taking the AP exam here at Austin High School, and kids at, like, Travis could be taking the different version, where they have, like, 2 different DBQs, different sets of LEQs, different sets of SAQs. So, like, at this point, it's even hard to predict what the prompts are going to be because there's different versions of the AP exam. So, you could even hear at Austin, like half of y'all could get one version, half get another. We've definitely had that happen here. So anyways, um, probably an LEQ topic. If it's an LEQ topic, maybe impacts of industrialization, continuities and changes associated with industrialization, maybe causes and effects of imperialism, maybe ways that people resist imperialism. That's kind of one of my concerns. I talked about this with Unit 3-4, with the existence to state expansion from Unit 3-4, they could have a resistance to imperialism in this time period. And I'm terrified that people won't know what to write. But for this one, at least, direct resistance, new state, religious resistance. There could be a compare processes for state expansion, compare the ways that imperial powers set up their colony. That one is, let me flip over. My brain is very fried today. I apologize if I seem all over the place. States strengthening control of their colony by switching from non-state to state colonial control, or using warfare to expand empire, like with Opium War, or maybe setting up a settler colony. That would be that one. And again, that one is compare and contrast processes for state expansion. There could also be a political revolution, LEQ, maybe compare and contrast the political revolutions, maybe impacts of the Enlightenment leading to political revolutions and spreading nationalism. Lots of potential things here. So please spend some time studying Unit 5 and 6. I think 5 and 6 are probably are the weakest areas overall for the year that I'm filming this video. So, all right, that is it. Good luck. If you have any questions, please come talk to me. I'm happy to help.